A man sat down in a borrowed house outside London and opened a notebook. He was not a soldier. Before the war, he had run a radio network. He wore a naval officer's uniform he had done almost nothing to earn, and if anyone had ever written out his job description, it would have read something close to professional friend. He poured the drinks, he handled the reporters, he found the houses, arranged the fishing trips, and absorbed the bad moods. And nearly every night, he wrote down what the most powerful American officer in Europe had said that day. He did it because that officer had told him to. His name was Harry Butcher. The officer was Dwight Eisenhower. And for something close to 3 years, Butcher recorded the private conversation of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force from a distance of about 6 feet. He was there for the rages. He was there for the doctor's visits. He was there when the man could not sleep, and when the man could not stop smoking, and when the man sat in a tent at Southwick House and decided to send 156,000 young men across the English Channel into weather no sane commander would have chosen. When the war ended, Butcher published a portion of it. The book ran 911 pages. It sold enormously. It also came close to ending the friendship because Eisenhower had assumed the diary belonged to him and discovered that it did not. Now here's the number that actually matters. The Butcher papers, held today at the Dwight Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, run to roughly 12,800 pages, 6.4 linear feet of shelf. The formal diary alone covers July 8th of 1942 through March 10th of 1945, and the literary rights did not pass into the public domain until 1994. 911 pages went out to the American public in 1946. Something on the order of 12,000 pages did not. That gap is what this episode is about, not the gossip inside it, the gap itself. Because Eisenhower is the rare commander where we do not have to guess. We're not reconstructing what men thought of him from hints and silences and the polite evasions of official histories. His chief of staff left a record. His deputy theater commander left a diary that now sits in the Library of Congress. His British superior left a diary so blunt that its unedited publication caused a diplomatic row more than half a century after the shooting stopped. His most famous subordinate wrote down exactly what he thought of his boss in a private journal his own family later handed to a historian. His personal driver wrote 2 books, and the second one detonated a scandal that is still being repeated on this platform every single week. Almost everyone around this man was writing things down, and a great deal of what they wrote does not match the statue. But I'm going to tell you something now that should shape how you hear everything that follows. A significant share of the most quoted private testimony about Dwight Eisenhower is fabricated, not exaggerated, not misremembered, manufactured by later writers for money. By the end of this, you will know exactly which quotations those are, who invented them, and why the invention worked so well that it is still working today. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story. Some of you served under officers who came up inside the system this man built. I want to do it justice, which in this case means doing something considerably harder than tearing him down. So let us do this properly. Let us put Dwight Eisenhower in front of a jury, and let us call his own staff as witnesses. Start with the reputation, because the reputation is what is on trial. The public Eisenhower was a construction of extraordinary quality. Kansas farm boy. The grin, the plainness. Life magazine and the Associated Press built him into something the United States badly needed in 1942 and 1943, which was proof that an ordinary American could run a world war. He was the anti-Patton and the anti-MacArthur, the man with no theatrical costume and no pearl-handled revolvers, and the press adored him for it because he was the only senior figure in the theater who consistently gave them something usable. Crusade in Europe, his own memoir, hardened the image into something close to scripture. Then, 8 years in the White House sanded off whatever edges remained, and by the time he died in 1969, the American public had a national grandfather where a wartime theater commander used to be. Underneath that image is a career that should raise the eyebrows of anyone who has ever worked inside a large institution. Dwight Eisenhower never commanded troops in combat. Not a platoon, not a company, not a battalion. He spent the First World War training tank crews in Pennsylvania and considered it the great humiliation of his life. In March of 1941, he was a lieutenant colonel. By February 11 of 1943, he wore 4 stars. On June 11th of 1942, George Marshall passed over 366 officers senior to him and handed him the European theater, and Eisenhower took up that command in London on June 25. 366 men. Every one of them had more time in grade, A great many of them had heard shots fired in anger, which he had not. I want to be careful here because this is precisely the point where a channel like this one can go lazy. The easy version of the story is that a staff officer with a pleasant smile was handed the biggest command in American history because he was good in meetings, and everybody who actually knew him understood it was a fraud. That version is available. It is well sourced. It is also, I think, wrong in a way that matters, and I would rather earn your disagreement than take the cheap route. So here's the question this episode is genuinely asking. When the men who worked beside Dwight Eisenhower wrote down what they thought of him in private, what exactly did they convict him of? If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to the witnesses. Before the testimony, understand who is testifying, because in any trial, the credibility of the witness is half the case. Harry Butcher, naval aide, in the room from 1942 through the spring of 1945. He is close, he is constant, and he is compromised, because he adored the man and because he later monetized the access. The British historian Max Hastings dismissed him as the embodiment of every gossip-ridden staff officer who ever lived. That is a fair warning label. It is not a reason to discard the evidence. Walter Bedell Smith, universally called Beetle, Chief of Staff at Allied Force Headquarters from September of 1942, and then at Supreme Headquarters through the surrender. Marshall's man originally, sent across the Atlantic to impose order. Ulcers so severe they put him in hospital repeatedly, and once so severe he discharged himself against medical advice to get back to work, a temper that became a legend in its own right. He is the single most important witness in this case, and I will explain why. Everett Hughes, Deputy Theater Commander, old friend, and keeper of a diary now held in the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress, with the war years running from 1940 to 1946. His handwriting is nearly unreadable, which is one reason it went largely unexamined for decades, and one reason it later became a playground for people who were not careful with it. It was Hughes who recommended Patton to Eisenhower for Corps Command after Kasserine, which means one of the most consequential appointments of the North African campaign came out of a private conversation between two friends, George Patton, who was not staff, but who was the loudest subordinate voice in the entire record, through the diaries and letters that Martin Blumenson assembled into the Patton Papers with what was effectively unlimited family access. Omar Bradley, whose second memoir, A General's Life, completed with Clay Blair after Bradley's death, is a substantially more candid document than the polished version he published in 1951, with a journalist doing the writing. Then the British contingent, which is where this gets sharp. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, whose war diaries were finally published without cuts in 2001 by Alex Danshev and Daniel Todman, Bernard Montgomery in his private letters, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Deputy Supreme Commander, sitting directly at Eisenhower's elbow with a knife out for somebody, Major General Kenneth Strong, the intelligence chief, whose memoir Intelligence at the Top is one of the calmer and more useful accounts, Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, who had written the original outline plan for the invasion before Eisenhower ever arrived, and who then had to watch a newcomer expand his 3-division landing into a 5-division landing and take the credit for the result. And behind all of them, George Marshall in Washington, whose private view of Eisenhower turns out to be the most consequential opinion any of them held. That is the roster. Now, the charges. The first charge is the simplest, and the one that surprises people least once they hear it. The man the American public was shown did not exist. Butcher's diary and the medical record behind it describe a human being coming apart under load. In the weeks before the invasion, by the account preserved at the Eisenhower National Historic Site, he was drinking on the order of 24 cups of coffee a day and smoking 6 packs of cigarettes, while averaging roughly 2 hours of uninterrupted sleep a night. Other credible accounts put the tobacco at 4 packs of Camels daily. Take the lower figure, and it is still 80 cigarettes between waking and sleeping, on a body already producing dangerous blood pressure, migraines, insomnia, a ringing in the ears, and a knee that had been ruined at West Point and never properly repaired. The temper was real, and it was ugly. The grin that Americans knew from newsreels was a professional instrument, deployed deliberately, and it went away the moment the cameras did. Butcher recorded the black moods. He recorded the profanity, which was extensive and inventive and came out of the man in a Kansas accent that made it worse. He recorded a commander who could travel from public charm to private fury inside a single doorway, and who then required the people around him to absorb the fury and produce the charm again on demand. And then there is the detail I find more revealing than any single outburst. Look at how the household actually functioned. Bedell Smith was understood across the entire headquarters to be the hatchet man. Air Marshal James Robb, who worked inside that building, put it plainly, that Eisenhower always needed somebody who would do the dirty work for him. Firings went through Smith. Confrontations went through Smith. The humiliating conversation with the offended ally, the dressing down of a corps commander, the message that ended a career, all of it went through Smith, and Smith's stomach ate itself doing it. Patton loathed him and called him unprintable things. Smith knew perfectly well that Patton hated his guts, and on at least one occasion declined to be the man sent to discipline Patton for exactly that reason, which tells you these were not abstractions to him. Here's the part that convicts. Senior officers across the theater worked out that Smith was the barrier and began going around him directly to Eisenhower, in flat violation of how a headquarters is supposed to operate. And Eisenhower allowed it, repeatedly, because stopping it would have required a confrontation, and confrontation was the one thing he would not do. I have read a great many headquarters memoirs for this channel. That single detail is worth more than 100 pages of temper anecdotes, because a temper is a personality trait, and this is a command failure. A commander who will not enforce his own chief of staff's authority has quietly announced to several hundred ambitious officers that the shortest path to influence runs directly through his need to be liked. Every one of them heard it. Most of them acted on it. And it got worse than that, because the same instinct reappears in the reliefs, which is the fourth charge and the heaviest one. Eisenhower himself understood exactly what Smith had been to him. He called him the greatest general manager of the war. When Smith died in 1961, Eisenhower reflected that a commander's standing in history rests largely on his wisdom in selecting a chief of staff. Read that twice. That is the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force telling you, in his own voice, that the most consequential decision of his military life was a personnel choice. And there is one more piece of evidence on this charge, and it happens to be the diary itself. When Butcher's book appeared in 1946, Eisenhower was genuinely wounded by it. He had ordered the diary kept. He had assumed, in the way powerful men assume things about the people who work for them, that the record belonged to him. What he discovered was that a man he had treated as family had been taking notes for 3 years and now owned them. The friendship never fully recovered. Butcher went back to broadcasting. Eisenhower, for the rest of his life, was careful about who was in the room and what got written down, and Crusade in Europe reads exactly like a document produced by a man who has learned what happens when somebody else holds the pen. I find that reaction more revealing than anything inside the 911 pages. The Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force was not angry that the book was inaccurate. He was angry that it was published. Those are two completely different complaints, and only one of them is a defense. The second charge is the serious one, and it comes almost entirely from the British. The charge is that Dwight Eisenhower did not understand how to fight a war. Alan Brooke was the professional head of the British Army and one of the finest military minds of the 20th century, and his private assessment of the Supreme Commander runs close to contempt. In the unexpurgated diaries edited by Danchev and Todman, he judged Eisenhower to possess, in his own words, a very, very limited brain from a strategic point of view. He wrote that the man submerged himself in politics and neglected his military duties, partly because he knew so little about military matters in the first place. He wrote that Eisenhower understood nothing of what a commander in action actually requires. Montgomery went further, and Montgomery had less excuse because Montgomery wanted the job. In a letter to Brooke, he described Eisenhower as totally and utterly useless and said flatly that the man knew nothing about warfare. That was not a considered judgment written years later for a memoir. That was a field marshal writing to his own service chief about the officer he was serving under, with the campaign still running and men still dying. Tedder, sitting at Eisenhower's elbow as Deputy Supreme Commander, spent the autumn and winter of 1944 telling anyone who would listen that Eisenhower's own countrymen were going to conclude he had sold them to the British. And this is where the case against becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because there was a sustained high-level British effort to insert a land forces commander above the army groups and beneath Eisenhower, which in practice meant handing Montgomery the actual conduct of the war, and leaving Eisenhower as a figurehead in a French chateau signing directives that other men had written. That effort peaked during and after the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. It was not a rumor, and it was not a grudge. It was a live proposal at the highest level of the alliance. It was killed by George Marshall. In late January of 1945, passing through Marseille on his way to the conference at Yalta, Marshall told Eisenhower to his face that he would not accept a ground commander under any circumstances, and that, if such an arrangement were approved, he would resign as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. That is from Forrest Pogue's official Army history of the campaign. The Supreme Command which remains the closest thing we have to a neutral account of who did what to whom inside that headquarters. Sit with that for a moment. The supreme commander of the largest amphibious operation in human history kept authority over the conduct of the ground war because a man 3,000 miles away in Washington threatened to quit if he lost it. This is the part the popular histories glide past. The British criticism was not simple envy, and it was not entirely wrong. Eisenhower had never fought a battle. His feel for ground was learned rather than instinctive, and it shows in the record. It shows at Kasserine, where he had personally visited the Second Corps front and personally seen how Fredendall had scattered his divisions and had failed to force a correction. It shows in the Hurtgen Forest, where between September of 1944 and February of 1945, roughly 120,000 American soldiers were fed into a wood with no strategic value for something on the order of 33,000 casualties, and where a commander with a genuine feel for terrain would have smelled the thing rotting by the third week. Eisenhower did not stop it. Bradley ran it, and Eisenhower let it run. In the winter of 1944 and 45, he was commanding 48 divisions strung along a 600-mile front from the North Sea to Switzerland, and he was doing it having never once in his life given an order that got a rifle company killed while he watched. And there is one operational failure on Eisenhower's account that I think is worse than anything the British ever formally accused him of. And strangely, it is one they rarely raised, because they were fully as guilty of it as he was. On September 4 of 1944, British forces took the port of Antwerp intact, docks and cranes undamaged. It was the largest port in Northwest Europe, and it was the answer to every supply problem the Alliance had. It was also completely useless, because the approaches to it run roughly 60 miles down the Scheldt estuary, and the Germans held both banks. Nobody cleared the Scheldt. Montgomery went north into the Netherlands instead, toward Arnhem. Eisenhower approved it. The estuary was not finally cleared until November 8th, and the first supply convoy did not tie up at the docks in Antwerp until November 28th, which is 85 days after the port fell into Allied hands. For those 85 days, American and British divisions standing on the German border were supplied by truck convoys running hundreds of miles back to the Normandy beaches. That is why Patton's tanks sat dry in Lorraine. That is why the First Army was rationing artillery ammunition while it fed men into the Hurtgen. That is why the front stalled through the autumn. And the stalled front is precisely where the German army found the time and the space to rebuild the armored reserve that came through the Ardennes in December. Eisenhower saw the problem. He wrote about the problem in his own directives. He did not force the correction, because forcing it would have meant overruling Montgomery in the first week of September, at exactly the moment he was working hardest to keep Montgomery inside the tent. That, in my view, is the clearest single instance in the entire campaign where his instinct for holding the alliance together cost American and British soldiers their lives. It belongs on the charge sheet, and it belongs there in the first paragraph. And yet, I want to flag something about the two most damning witnesses that a careful listener should already have noticed. Alan Brooke thought George Marshall was a mediocre strategist as well. He thought Churchill was an active menace to sound planning, which he recorded at far greater length and with considerably more heat than anything he ever wrote about Eisenhower. Brooke's diary is a magnificent historical document, and it is also the private notebook of an exhausted, ferociously proud man who wrote at night specifically to burn off the day. And Montgomery, whatever his real gifts, was an applicant for the position. When the applicant tells you the incumbent is useless, you weigh it accordingly. Brooke also wrote, and this is the line the Eisenhower detractors never quote, that whatever the man lacked in military ability, he made up for by the charm of his personality. That is the prosecution's own star witness, conceding the core of the defense case inside a single clause. The third charge comes from the Americans, and it is the exact mirror image of the second. The British said he was not enough of a soldier. The Americans said he was too much of a politician, and specifically too much of a British one. The education began in North Africa, and it began badly. In November of 1942, faced with French forces shooting at American landings, Eisenhower authorized a deal with Admiral François Darlan, a senior figure of the Vichy regime, in exchange for an order to cease fire. It worked. It saved a significant number of American and British lives, and it opened the ports. It also handed the government of French North Africa to a collaborator, and it produced a firestorm in the British and American press and inside his own headquarters that took months to burn out. Only Roosevelt's public defense saved him. Here is what I think the Darlan business actually reveals, and it is not what the critics usually say. Eisenhower made a coldly practical calculation that the military result justified the political stain, And he was probably right on the arithmetic. What it revealed was a man who had already begun thinking in a currency other than battlefield advantage. Patton noticed. Everyone noticed. Patton's diary is merciless on this theme. He called Eisenhower divine destiny behind his back, a sneer at what he saw as naked political ambition dressed up as duty. 3 days after the German surrender, at a conference where Eisenhower asked his senior commanders not to litigate the campaign in public, Patton went back to his quarters and wrote that the speech carried the symptoms of political aspiration, and that the endless emphasis on cooperation with the British existed to paper over what he called strategic blunders which he unquestionably committed. Patton then added the honest qualifier that historians almost always cut, which was that he could not tell whether those blunders were Eisenhower's own or the price of cooperating with London. That qualifier matters, and I want to give it weight. Even Patton, at his angriest, understood that he could not separate the man from the coalition he was managing. The specific American grievance had a name, and the name was Market Garden. In September of 1944, Eisenhower approved Montgomery's plan to drive a narrow corridor through the Netherlands and across the Rhine, and he approved it while simultaneously giving Montgomery logistical priority over Bradley's army group. Patton's Third Army was rationing fuel. Bradley was rationing artillery ammunition, and the resources went north to a plan that failed, run by a commander who had spent the entire campaign telling his own government that the Supreme Commander was useless. Bradley, in a general's life, is measured about this, and in some ways more damaging for being measured, because Bradley had no theatrical instincts at all. He is frankly critical of Eisenhower's weaknesses as an Allied commander in North Africa and in Sicily. He is harsh about Montgomery's behavior throughout. And during the Ardennes crisis, when Eisenhower transferred operational control of the northern shoulder of the American line to Montgomery, Bradley told his own Supreme Commander that he would resign rather than accept that arrangement as permanent. Understand the weight of that. By the end of the war, Bradley's 12th Army Group controlled 43 divisions and 1.3 million men, the largest force of American soldiers ever placed under a single field commander. That officer told the Supreme Commander he would quit. Underneath every one of these episodes sits the oldest American grievance of the campaign, which is that Eisenhower's instinct in any Anglo-American dispute was to lean on the American and accommodate the Briton, because the American would take it and the Briton would go to Churchill. Every officer in the American command structure believed this. Many of them were right about specific instances. Whether it was a defect of character or the correct handling of a coalition in which the British had been fighting 2 years longer and were running out of men, is the question this whole episode turns on, and I am coming back to it. But that is still not the strongest charge. Here is the strongest charge. The fourth charge is that Dwight Eisenhower would not fire the men who needed firing. In February of 1943, the American Second Corps under Lloyd Fredendall was attacked in southern Tunisia and came apart. In 10 days, the Americans were driven back 50 miles and lost 183 tanks and nearly 7,000 men, of whom 300 were killed and 3,000 went missing. Kasserine Pass. The first serious American ground engagement against the German army in the West, and it was a rout in front of the entire British Empire. Fredendall had built himself a headquarters roughly 70 miles behind the front, dug into a ravine by engineers who should have been building defensive positions forward. He had scattered his divisions in penny packets across ground he had never personally inspected. He issued orders in an invented private code his own subordinates could not reliably decipher. His relationship with his division commanders had collapsed into open contempt in both directions. Eisenhower knew a great deal of this before the battle. He had visited, he had seen the ravine, he had received the reports and the complaints. When it broke, he sent Ernest Harmon forward to assess the situation. Harmon found a corps commander who was finished, who told him the party was his, and went to bed. Harmon came back and told Eisenhower plainly that Fredendall was no damn good and had to go. Eisenhower did not act immediately. He hesitated, consulted, worried about the effect on American prestige in front of the British, and finally relieved Fredendall on March 5 of 1943, roughly 2 weeks after Harmon's report, and after the dead were already buried. And now, the part that should make everyone listening put the coffee down. Lloyd Fredendall went home to the United States, was promoted to lieutenant general, was given a major training command, and was welcomed with a parade. That is the system this channel exists to indict. And notice that it is not really Eisenhower's failure at all. It is the machine. A corps commander loses a battle, gets his soldiers killed through demonstrable incompetence, is relieved by his theater commander, and is rewarded on arrival because publicly punishing him would have embarrassed the institution that promoted him in the first place. The failure was absorbed, laundered, and given a third star. And if that pattern sounds familiar from somewhere other than a battlefield, if you have ever watched a manager fail so completely that the only available solution was to promote him sideways into a job where he could do less damage, you are not imagining the resemblance. The institution protects itself first. It always has. But Fredendall is the defensible case because Fredendall did eventually go. The indefensible case is John Clifford Hodges Lee. Lee ran services of supply and then communication zone, which meant he controlled the flow of every bullet, every gallon of gasoline, and every replacement rifleman reaching the front in Northwest Europe. He was pompous on a scale that became a running joke across two armies. His initials were said throughout the theater to stand for Jesus Christ himself. After the liberation of Paris, he moved his headquarters into the city and commandeered the best hotels in it for his staff. At the precise moment, combat divisions 200 miles east were rationing artillery shells and freezing in the Hurtgen. Eisenhower was privately furious about it. Bradley was furious. Patton was incandescent. Every soldier in the theater understood exactly what it looked like. Lee kept his job. He kept it through the winter. He kept it to the end of the war. Now compare the speeds. Compare how long it took to remove a man who had lost a battle against how long it took to remove a man who was humiliating the army in front of its own soldiers, which was never. And then compare both of those to the third case, which is the one that exposes the whole pattern. In August of 1943, in Sicily, George Patton struck 2 hospitalized American soldiers and accused them of cowardice. Eisenhower found out almost immediately. He did not relieve him. He wrote Patton a severe private letter, ordered apologies, and worked hard to keep the story out of print because he had concluded that Patton's value as a combat commander outweighed the offense. That was a defensible command judgment, and I think it was the right one. Then, in November, the columnist Drew Pearson broke the story publicly in the United States, and everything changed. Patton was left without a command for months, and in April of 1944, when Patton made an offhand remark at Knutsford about Britain and America ruling the post-war world, Eisenhower came within an inch of sending him home permanently over a sentence at a social function, less than 2 months before the invasion, with the best exploitation commander in the American Army sitting idle. Line the 3 cases up. Fredendall loses a battle, and it takes 2 weeks. Lee humiliates the army for a year, and nothing happens at all. Patton commits a genuine offense in private and is protected, and then commits a public relations offense and is nearly destroyed. In my view, that asymmetry is the single most legitimate charge on this entire indictment. Not the strategy, not the deference to Montgomery. Those are arguable. This is not arguable. Dwight Eisenhower was demonstrably faster to act against embarrassment than against incompetence, and men died in the space between those 2 speeds. Now, the case gets complicated because before any jury can render a verdict, somebody has to challenge the evidence. I told you at the start that a great deal of the most quoted private testimony about Eisenhower is manufactured. Here is that section, and I would ask you to pay close attention because this is where most of what you have heard about this man on the internet actually comes from. Start with the most famous story in the entire Eisenhower canon. The story goes that at the end of the war, Eisenhower wrote to George Marshall asking permission to divorce Mamie and marry his Irish driver, Kay Summersby, and that Marshall wrote back promising to bust him out of the army and to see to it that he never drew a peaceful breath for the rest of his life. Harry Truman, the story continues, later found those letters in the files as president and destroyed them. That story appears in exactly one place. It comes from Merle Miller's oral biography of Truman, published in 1974 under the title Plain Speaking, and it is presented as Truman speaking. No such letter exists in the Marshall Papers at the George Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia. The archivists have looked. The historian Robert Farrell went back to Miller's own recordings at the Truman Library and reported that the tapes do not support the book's text, and that there is no Truman conversation about Kay Summersby on them at all. Farrell's conclusion was that Miller simply invented the quotations. The only corroborating voice was a former Truman military aide who claimed to have seen letters that nobody has been able to locate since. I want to be precise about my own position here. I'm not telling you that Eisenhower and Summersby had no relationship. I'm telling you that the single most repeated piece of evidence for the most sensational version of it is uncorroborated and, on the best available analysis, was made up by an author who needed a chapter. Now Summersby herself, because her 2 books are not the same kind of document at all. Eisenhower Was My Boss, published in 1948 while everyone involved was alive and able to sue, is a useful and largely trusted account of daily life inside that headquarters. It contains no affair claim whatsoever. Past Forgetting, published in 1975, contains the affair claim. It was published after Eisenhower was dead. It was contracted while Summersby herself was dying of cancer, and she did not write it. It was ghostwritten by a professional writer named Barbara Wyden. Carlo D'Este, whose Eisenhower, A Soldier's Life is the most careful, full-length military biography we have, calls the book fanciful, and concludes it is extremely improbable that the relationship ever became what the book describes. Stephen Ambrose acknowledged real closeness and rejected the rest. Eisenhower's son, John, who was inside that headquarters, described her as the cheerful, pretty fixture of the place and said flatly that he did not know what, if anything, had happened. Montgomery, who had no reason on this earth to protect Eisenhower's reputation, wrote in his own diary that the book should never have been written. Then there is Everett Hughes. The Hughes diary is genuinely one of the most candid private sources on this headquarters, and it deserves to be used. D'Este's reading of it is that Hughes recorded disparaging observations about how Eisenhower and Summersby conducted themselves in 1943, and never once claimed that an affair had actually occurred. D'Este also assesses Hughes as a notorious and unreliable gossip, who was carrying on an affair of his own at the time. The lurid version of the Hughes diary, including the famous shorthand that supposedly encoded Summersby's name, reaches the general public almost entirely through one book, The War Between the Generals, published in 1981 by David Irving. Irving is the writer whom a British court found in the year 2000 to have deliberately falsified historical evidence, and who is an adjudicated denier of the Holocaust. His handling of the Hughes material and of the Patton diaries cannot be trusted, and I am flagging that explicitly because I have not been able to verify those specific entries against the originals in the Library of Congress. If somebody watching has worked directly with those boxes, I would like to hear from you. And now the biggest one, the one that is going to bother some of you, because it bothered me. For roughly 40 years, the standard biographer of Dwight Eisenhower was Stephen Ambrose. His 2-volume life and his single-volume study, Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, are the books through which most Americans encountered this man. Ambrose's foundational claim, the thing that gave him unique authority over every rival, was that Eisenhower had personally selected him and had sat with him for hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviews across 5 years. Beginning in 2010, that claim collapsed. Tim Reeves, the deputy director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, went through the archive's own daily logs, appointment books, and correspondence. Richard Rayner published the results in The New Yorker in a piece called Channeling Ike. What the records show is that Eisenhower met Ambrose perhaps 3 times, for a combined total of under 5 hours, and never once alone. Ambrose had cited 9 interview sessions in the Supreme Commander. For 7 of them, the documentary record places Eisenhower somewhere else entirely. And the origin story, in which Eisenhower summoned the young historian after admiring his biography of Henry Halleck, turns out to be inverted. Ambrose solicited the relationship. Think about what that does to the material in this episode. The most widely read authority on Eisenhower's private character built his standing on access he did not have. Whatever Eisenhower confided to Stephen Ambrose in those hundreds of hours, he did not confide, because the hours did not exist. So here is where the trial stands. We came looking for the private record of a famous man, and we found that the anti-legend had been manufactured by more or less the same process as the legend. Miller needed a chapter. A dying woman's ghostwriter needed a scandal. Irving needed a thesis. Ambrose needed a career. And all 4 of them were selling the same product, which was intimacy with a man nobody could reach anymore. Which brings us to the defense. The defense begins by rejecting the premise of the entire prosecution, and I think it is right to reject it. Every hostile witness in this case is convicting Dwight Eisenhower of failing to be something he was never appointed to be. Brooke measured him as a strategist. Montgomery measured him as an Army group commander. Patton measured him as a fighting general. He was none of those things, and George Marshall had not sent him to London to be any of them. Look at what the job actually was. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force controlled 3 Army groups, 8 field armies, 2 tactical air forces, and during the invasion period the strategic bomber forces and a naval armada, staffed and manned by the United States, Britain, Canada, Free France, Poland, and a half-dozen occupied nations, every one of which had its own government, its own press, its own political survival at stake, and its own competing theory of how the war ought to be won. On the 6th of June, 1944, that machine put roughly 156,000 men onto 5 beaches, supported by something on the order of 5,000 ships and landing craft and 11,000 aircraft, and it had 326,000 men ashore inside a week. It had never been done. There was no manual for it. And the thing that made it possible was not brilliance in maneuver. It was that a fractious alliance of proud and suspicious nations agreed, for one morning, to do the same thing at the same time. Somebody had to make that agreement hold. That was the job. That was the entire job. Here's the test I would put to anyone who believes Eisenhower was a lightweight. Name the replacement. Montgomery could not have held the Americans for a month, and by the end of 1944, he could barely hold them for a week. Brooke could not have held the Americans at all. Patton would have detonated the alliance inside a fortnight and enjoyed doing it. Marshall was needed in Washington and understood that better than anyone. Bradley did not have the standing with the British and never would. Mark Clark had the ambition and none of the trust. There is not one serious candidate on either side of the Atlantic who could have kept that coalition intact through Anzio, through the Darlin Uproar, through Market Garden, through the Ardennes, through the endless Montgomery crisis, and through the political minefield of de Gaulle and the Free French, and produced a unified surrender in May of 1945. I believe that is the correct defense, and I believe it is decisive. The complaint that Eisenhower behaved like a chairman of the board rather than a commander is accurate, and it is not a criticism. It is a job description. It is the reason the invasion worked. And let me give you the operational detail that almost never survives into the documentaries, because it answers the charge that he contributed nothing but charm. Frederick Morgan's planning staff had produced an outline for the invasion long before Eisenhower ever arrived in Britain. That plan called for 3 divisions landing across a front of roughly 25 miles. When Eisenhower and Montgomery examined it in January of 1944, both men independently concluded it was too thin to survive a serious counterattack, and the plan was rebuilt from the frame outward. What actually went in on the 6th of June was 5 divisions across a front closer to 50 miles, with 2 additional beaches, 3 airborne divisions instead of 1, and a landing on the Cottontown Peninsula that had not existed in the original scheme at all. That expansion is not a staff adjustment. It meant finding landing craft that did not exist anywhere in the theater. Finding them meant postponing the operation from May into June, which meant surrendering a month of campaigning weather in a war being fought against a clock. It also meant stripping resources from the planned invasion of southern France, which meant 3 months of grinding argument with the British over whether that operation should happen at all. Eisenhower drove that decision, held it against pressure from both governments, and absorbed the political cost personally. Whatever you conclude about his feel for maneuver warfare, that was a correct military judgment made under time pressure with incomplete information, and it is a substantial part of the reason the beachhead held in the 3rd week of June when the German armored counterattack finally arrived. A man who understood nothing about war does not look at another officer's plan and correctly identify that it is 1/3 too small. The second point for the defense is the broad front. The great strategic indictment is that Eisenhower advanced everywhere, rather than concentrating for a single knockout thrust into Germany, and that this cost months and lives. Montgomery argued it at the time, and every Montgomery partisan has argued it since. Pogue's official history, and the weight of scholarship since, concludes that the single thrust was logistically impossible. There was not enough port capacity, not enough truck transport, and not enough fuel to sustain that kind of concentrated punch that deep into Germany in the autumn of 1944. The flanks of such a thrust would have been a standing invitation to exactly the kind of counterattack the Germans proved in December that they could still generate. And there is a piece of evidence for the broad front that nobody can argue with, because the Germans supplied it themselves. When the counteroffensive came through the Ardennes, the broad front's supposed weakness turned out to be its great strength, because Eisenhower had depth and flexibility to draw on. In the first week of that battle, he moved roughly 250,000 men and 50,000 vehicles into the fight. 600,000 American soldiers were eventually engaged. 19,000 of them were killed. It was the largest battle the United States Army has ever fought, and it was contained inside 6 weeks by a command structure that the British had spent the entire autumn describing as incompetent. And it is worth noting who was right about the intelligence. Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's own intelligence chief, had flagged German armored formations refitting behind the Eifel. That warning was discounted downstream. The Supreme Commander's staff was not the part of the machine that failed in December. At the conference at Verdun on December 19, with the American line broken and senior officers around the table looking gray, Eisenhower opened by telling them the present situation should be regarded as one of opportunity rather than disaster, and that there would be only cheerful faces at that table. It is the sort of line that reads like a movie script until you remember that he then released his entire strategic reserve, turned Patton's army 90 degrees, and had the counterattack moving in 72 hours. The third point, and it is the one I keep returning to, sometime around the 5th of June, 1944, Sitting with the weather reports and the knowledge that he had personally overruled every instinct telling him to wait, Dwight Eisenhower took out a pencil and wrote a short statement to be released in the event the invasion failed. He wrote that the landings had failed, that he had withdrawn the troops, that the decision to attack had been his alone based on the best information available, and that the soldiers and the airmen and the sailors had done everything that bravery and devotion to duty could do. And then he wrote the sentence that ought to be carved into the wall of every command school in the Western world. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He folded it into his wallet. He never used it. He had misdated it by a full month, which tells you more about the state of that man's mind in that week than any diary entry ever could. I have now read the private assessments of every hostile witness in this case, and not one of them ever accused him of dodging responsibility. Brooke thought he was a poor strategist. Montgomery thought he was useless. Patton thought he was a politician in uniform. Not one of them, not once, in diaries they never expected the public to read, said that Dwight Eisenhower was a coward or that he passed blame downward onto subordinates. That is a remarkable unanimity among men who agreed on nothing else on this earth, and I think it is worth more than every temper anecdote in the Butcher papers combined. And there is one witness I have deliberately held back until now, because his testimony outweighs every other voice in this episode combined. George Marshall did not like Dwight Eisenhower. That is putting it too strongly. George Marshall did not much like anybody, professionally speaking. He had deliberately turned himself into an instrument for evaluating officers, and had trained the warmth out of himself because warmth corrupts judgment. For years, he refused to call Eisenhower by his first name, and the one time Eisenhower slipped and called him George, he was corrected on the spot. In December of 1941, with the Philippines collapsing, Marshall brought a newly arrived brigadier general into his office, laid out the disaster in the Pacific in a few sentences, and asked him what the United States ought to do about it. Eisenhower asked for a few hours, went away, and came back with an answer that essentially conceded the Philippines were already lost, while arguing that the United States had to spend heavily on the attempt anyway, because every other ally on Earth was watching how Americans treated a garrison they could not save. It was the correct answer, and it was an unwelcome one. Marshall put him in the War Plans Division and began watching him. Now here's the fact that almost never gets said out loud, and it reframes everything. Command of the invasion of Europe was supposed to be Marshall's. He had earned it. Everyone in Washington and London expected it. And Roosevelt decided at the end of 1943 that he could not spare him from Washington. So the greatest command in the history of the United States Army went instead to the officer Marshall had personally elevated over 366 seniors 18 months before. Marshall lost the job of his life to his own protege, and he never undercut him, not once, not in the correspondence, not in the diaries of the men around him, not in a single recorded private conversation across 17 months of campaign. When the British came for Eisenhower's authority in the winter of 1945, the one man on earth with the strongest imaginable motive to let him fall was the man who put his own resignation on the table to keep him standing. I think that is the most important single fact in this episode, and I think it is worth more than every diary entry I have quoted. Alan Brooke assessed Eisenhower across a conference table. Montgomery assessed him as a rival. Patton assessed him as a frustrated subordinate. George Marshall assessed him the way a professional assesses the man holding the job he wanted for himself, which is the harshest possible standard there is. Marshall never wavered. That is the defense. Let me put the hard numbers in one place, because this audience checks them and because the shape of them is the argument. 366 officers passed over in June of 1942, 23 months from lieutenant colonel to 4-star general, 0 days of combat command in a career that had by then run 26 years, 911 published pages of his aide's diary against roughly 12,800 pages sitting in the archive at Abilene, with literary rights passing to the public only in 1994, 24 cups of coffee a day, between 4 and 6 packs of cigarettes a day, 2 hours of unbroken sleep a night in the weeks before the invasion. And then, in March of 1949, his physician Howard Snyder telling him to cut down from 4 packs to 1, at which point Eisenhower quit entirely during a bridge game and never smoked another cigarette for the remaining 20 years of his life. 10 days at Kasserine, 50 miles of ground surrendered, 183 tanks, nearly 7,000 casualties, of whom 300 were killed and 3,000 went missing. Fredendall relieved on March 5 of 1943 and promoted on arrival in the United States. 120,000 American soldiers committed to the Hurtgen Forest across 5 months for roughly 33,000 casualties, and a strategic result no serious historian has ever managed to defend. 48 divisions across a 600-mile front in December of 1944. 600,000 Americans engaged in the Ardennes, 19,000 American dead in 6 weeks. 250,000 men and 50,000 vehicles moved into the battle in the first week alone. 156,000 men landed on the 6th of June. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 326,000 men ashore within 7 days. And one handwritten note, misdated by a month, accepting sole blame for a failure that never came. Now the verdict. I've gone back and forth on this one more than almost any episode I have written for this channel, and I want to give you my actual reasoning rather than just a conclusion. On the charge that he was not a soldier, I return a verdict of guilty and irrelevant. He was not a soldier in the sense that Brooke and Patton meant it. He never developed the tactical eye that comes only from having been responsible for a battalion in contact, and the record shows it at Kasserine and in the Hurtgen and in the weeks after Falaise, but the charge is misfiled. The Alliance did not need a Fifth Army commander. It needed a man who could prevent a war between allies from breaking out inside a war against Germany, and there was exactly one of those available. On the charge that he was too political, I return a verdict of guilty and grateful. Yes, he calculated. Yes, he thought about how every decision would read in London and Washington and in the newspapers, and Patton was correct that political ambition was part of the man's makeup from very early on. But that same political instinct is why the coalition survived Darlan, survived Montgomery, survived Market Garden, and survived the Ardennes. The trait his critics identified correctly was the trait that made the job possible. On the charge that he was slow to relieve failing commanders, I return a verdict of guilty without qualification, and this is where the honest criticism of this man has to land and stay. The Fredendall delay cost lives. The retention of John Lee cost the Army enormous credibility with its own soldiers at the exact moment those soldiers were being asked to die in the Hurtgen. And the reason for both was identical, which is that Dwight Eisenhower could not bear a confrontation he had not delegated to Bedell Smith. A commander who outsources his own hardness has a hole in him, and men fall through it. But here is where I have ended up, and it is not where I expected to end up when I began this research. The scandal in this story is not what Eisenhower's staff said about him in private. What they said in private was, broadly, what capable people say about a boss under impossible strain, some of it perceptive, some of it envious, some of it vicious, and most of it contradictory. Brooke thought he was hopeless and also charming. Patton thought he was a politician and also owed him his career 3 separate times. Bradley thought he was weak with Montgomery and served him loyally to the last day. Bedell Smith burned out his own stomach doing the man's dirty work and called him worth it. The scandal is what happened afterward. The American public was never given the Eisenhower his staff actually knew. It was given a Kansas farm boy who won a war with common sense and a grin. And then, when that portrait became too dull to sell, it was given a second fictional Eisenhower, the philandering weakling of Merle Miller's invented letters and a dying woman's ghost-written confession and David Irving's decoded diary and Stephen Ambrose's imaginary interviews. 2 frauds, 30 years apart, both highly profitable, both aimed at the same market. And in between them sat the actual man, who was an administrator of genuine genius with a serious flaw in his spine when it came to firing people and whose real story was apparently not commercial enough for anybody to bother telling. This is the systemic point, and I think it is the one worth taking away. The American military establishment in 1942 did something genuinely intelligent. It looked at the problem in front of it, understood correctly that the problem was coalition management rather than battlefield brilliance, and reached down past 366 more senior officers to find the one man who could actually do that job. That was the system working. It was very likely the best single personnel decision the United States made in the entire war. And then the same establishment spent the next 30 years lying about what it had done. It could not bring itself to say out loud that the greatest victory in American history had been organized by a staff officer who had never heard a shot fired in anger, so it dressed him in a warrior's costume he had never asked for and which did not fit. The legend was not built to honor Dwight Eisenhower. It was built to spare the country the discomfort of learning what modern war actually rewards. And when the costume finally split, as costumes always do, the truth underneath looked like a scandal instead of what it was, which was competence of a deeply unglamorous kind. What that cost is not difficult to trace. It cost Bedell Smith his health and arguably his life. He carried the confrontations his commander would not carry, and the ulcers that came with them followed him into the peace, into the embassy in Moscow, into the Central Intelligence Agency, and into an early grave in 1961 at the age of 65. It cost the men of the Second Corps in February of 1943, who paid for a 2-week delay while a theater commander worked up the nerve to remove a Corps commander he had already privately judged unfit. It cost the soldiers who went into the Hurtgen Forest through the autumn of 1944, while the Supreme Commander's attention was fixed on the alliance crisis to his north, and who fell at a rate of roughly 1 American casualty for every 4 men committed, in a battle that achieved nothing anybody has since been able to name. And it cost Eisenhower himself, in a way that does not get said often enough. He spent 3 years as the human shock absorber between 2 nations that did not much like each other, and he did it inside a body that was actively failing, and his reward was to be remembered first as a grinning simplification and then as a tabloid. He is the only Allied theater commander of the Second World War whose actual professional achievement is harder to see today than it was in 1945. There is a final entry from the Hughes diary, quoted by Rick Atkinson in The Guns at Last Light, written during the worst days of the Ardennes crisis, when the alliance was tearing at itself over who should command what. Hughes, watching field marshals and generals behave like children while young men froze to death in the Belgian forests, wrote that we are all so human that it is pitiful, and that we never grow up. That is the truest sentence anybody on that staff ever wrote about the people running the war, and it applies to every man in this episode, including the one on trial. So what did Eisenhower's own staff say about him in private? They said he had a filthy temper and a manufactured smile. They said he was killing himself with tobacco and coffee and would not stop. They said he did not understand ground warfare, that he leaned too far toward the British, and that he would not fire a man who plainly deserved firing. They said he needed somebody else to be the villain so that he could go on being liked. All of that is in the record, all of it is sourced, and none of it is a fabrication. They also said, every last one of them, in the moments when they were being honest rather than clever, that they could not think of another man alive who could have done it. That is the verdict I would give you. Dwight Eisenhower was not a great general. He was something rarer and, in 1944, considerably more useful. He was the one man in the Western world who could make more than a dozen nations move in the same direction on the same morning. And he did it while his own body came apart, and he wrote out in advance, in pencil, that if the whole thing failed, the fault would be his alone. The tragedy is not that his staff criticized him behind his back. Staffs always do. The tragedy is that the truth about this man was interesting enough to tell, and almost nobody bothered. If your father or grandfather served in the European theater under this command, at Supreme Headquarters in the Communication Zone, in the Second Corps in Tunisia, or in the Hurtgen, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter. Drop them in the comments. That is the story. The sources are in the description. I will see you in the next one.